It all began, as many important things do, quite quietly, not with a thunderous announcement, or a grand procession, not at first. No, this was a seed planted in hallowed ground, inside the stone walls of monasteries. These were places of prayer, of contemplation, and as it turned out, of nascent theatre. This was around the 10th century, a time when the world felt old and new all at once. A time when faith was the air people breathed, and stories were the water that quenched their spiritual thirst. The monks, you see, were keepers of stories. The biggest story of all for them was the Christian story. They chanted it in Latin, a language few outside their walls understood, but some stories, some moments demanded more than just chanting. They yearned to be shown, to be felt. Imagine Easter morning, the holiest of days. A question was asked, "Whom do you seek, quem quaeritis?" in the Latin tongue. This simple question and its answer became a tiny play, a moment of divine drama right there in the church. The actors were priests or monks, their costumes were their usual church vestments. The stage was the altar or the space before it. These initial whispers, these quem quaeritis moments, didn't stay small for long. Like a well-tended plant, they began to grow. Other biblical scenes found their way into the church services. Christmas naturally was a popular choice. The story of the shepherds, guided by a star. The Magi, bringing their exotic gifts. These were perfect for a little dramatic representation. The church itself became a kind of stage, the nave, the choir, different parts of the building. They all played their part in these unfolding sacred dramas. The language was still Latin mostly. This was the language of God as far as the church was concerned. The language of scholarship, of official pronouncements. But the actions, the gestures, the visual elements, these spoke a universal language. A mother holding her child, an angel appearing in glory. Even if the words were not fully understood by everyone, the meaning, the emotional core of the story shone through. It was a step towards making faith more accessible, more tangible for the common folk gathered in the pews. These liturgical plays, as they are now called, became more elaborate. More characters were added. Simple props might be used, a manger, a star. The music, always a part of church services, swelled to support the drama. Latin was the language of the church, true. It was dignified, ancient, and for many, utterly incomprehensible. Imagine sitting in church week after week, hearing beautiful sounds, solemn pronouncements, but not grasping the precise meaning of the words. This was the reality for much of the medieval population. The stories were there, held within the Latin liturgy, but they were veiled, kept at a certain distance. Something clearly had to change if the stories were to truly reach everyone. And change it did, slowly but surely. The shift began subtly, perhaps with a single vernacular word. A local name for a common object slipped into a Latin phrase, or a brief explanation in the common tongue. A little aside to help the audience along, these were small cracks in the dam of Latin exclusivity. And through these cracks, the language of the people began to flow. The reasons were practical and also deeply spiritual. If the plays were to teach, to inspire, to warn, then people needed to understand the dialogue, not just guess from the actions. This move to the vernacular, English, French, German, and so on, was revolutionary. It was like the stories were being reborn, given new breath, new life in the language of everyday existence. Suddenly, the shepherds in the nativity play didn't just mumble in Latin. As the plays grew in popularity and scope, something else happened. They started to outgrow the churches, literally and perhaps figuratively too. The spaces within the church, even grand cathedrals, had their limits. The congregations were growing larger, more eager, and the stories themselves were becoming more ambitious, requiring more space, more actors, more spectacle. The church, once the sole incubator of this drama, was becoming a bit too small, a bit too restrictive for the burgeoning theatrical spirit. It was time for a change of scenery. So the plays moved out of the incense-filled air of the sanctuary and into the bustling, often muddy reality of the medieval town. The churchyard was an early new venue, still close to the sacred, but with more room to breathe. Then the marketplace, the town square, the very heart of communal life. This was a significant step. It brought the sacred stories directly into the secular world, where people lived, worked, and socialized. The division between church and everyday life began to soften just a little. This move outdoors had profound implications. It changed who saw the plays, No longer just the church-going congregation, but everyone in town and visitors from surrounding villages. Section 5. The guilds take the reins, crafting miracles and mysteries. Once the plays moved firmly into the public sphere, a new kind of organization stepped in. These were the guilds, the powerful trade associations of the medieval world. Bakers, weavers, shipwrights, goldsmiths. Each craft had its own guild, a sort of union and social club combined. They were influential, well-organized, and had resources, and they saw in these burgeoning religious dramas an opportunity for civic pride, for religious devotion, and perhaps for a bit of friendly competition. Who could put on the most impressive show? The guilds took over the production of many of these plays, especially the large-scale cycles of biblical stories. These became known as mystery plays, not mystery as in a whodunit we'd watch in 2025, but mystery from the Latin mysterium, meaning a religious truth or rite, or perhaps from ministerium, meaning a craft or trade. A rather fitting double meaning, as it turned out. Each guild would often take responsibility for a specific play, one that resonated with their particular craft. A delightful and very practical arrangement. So the shipwrights might stage the story of Noah's Ark. Makes sense, doesn't it? They knew a thing or two about building boats. The bakers could take on the Last Supper with its focus on bread. Section 6, pageant wagons and heavenly machines. The spectacle unfurls. With the guilds now steering the ship, or rather the pageant wagon, the presentation of these religious dramas became quite an affair. The term pageant wagon itself conjures up a wonderful image. These were, in essence, mobile stages. Elaborately decorated carts, each carrying a single scene, or sometimes a couple of related scenes. Imagine a parade, but instead of floats you have moving theatrical sets, each one telling a part of the grand biblical narrative, from the creation of the world to the Last Judgment. A truly epic undertaking, rolling through the town. These wagons would move from one appointed station to another, stopping at predetermined locations in the city, perhaps in front of the mayor's house, or in a wide open square. The audience would gather at these stations, waiting for the next part of the story to arrive. This meant that many people could see the entire cycle of plays, not all at once, but in a sequence throughout the day, or sometimes for the larger cycles over several days. It was a festival, a religious observance, and a theatrical marathon, all rolled into one remarkable community event. The stages themselves, though mobile, were not always simple. Guilds vied to create the most impressive visual effects. Heaven might be represented by a raised platform adorned with golden fabrics and shining lights. Angels, sometimes lowered by ropes and pulleys, a deus ex machina in its early form. Hell, often depicted as a monstrous mouth, the hell mouth would belch smoke and fire, with devils capering about. These were not subtle effects, but they were certainly effective, designed to awe, to inspire fear, and to teach clear moral lessons. The medieval audience expected spectacle, and they got it. The ingenuity involved was considerable. Remember, this was long before electricity or modern stage technology. Trapdoors allowed characters to appear and disappear suddenly. Sound effects, thunder sheets, rattling chains added to the drama. Costumes were often rich and symbolic. God might be dressed as a pope or an emperor. Devils in dark, grotesque outfits, often with animalistic features. Section 7. Tales of creation, fall and redemption. The great cycles play out. These pageant wagons told the great narratives of the Christian Bible, often called mystery plays. They aimed to tell the whole story, from creation to the Last Judgment, a cosmic drama with lessons about obedience, temptation, and consequence. Section 8. Good deeds and devilish temptations. Morality plays emerged in the 15th century, focusing on allegorical stories about the human soul's struggle. The main character, Everyman, represents humanity facing virtues and vices. These plays taught moral lessons, emphasizing the eternal consequences of choices. One famous play, Everyman, explores what truly matters in life. Section 9. Echoes through time. The enduring legacy of medieval stages. The great era of medieval religious drama eventually drew to a close. By the 16th century, things were changing. The Reformation brought about huge shifts in religious thought and practice. In England, religious plays came under suspicion, seen as too Catholic or too worldly. Professional theatre companies offered new stories and entertainment. The pageant wagons eventually rolled to a stop. But the legacy of these medieval plays is immense. They laid the groundwork for the theatre that followed. Think of Shakespeare writing just a generation later. He would have known these traditions, the idea of episodic storytelling, of mixing comedy and tragedy, of characters representing broad human types. These elements can be traced back to the mystery and morality plays. The very notion of public theatre, of drama as a communal event, owes a huge debt to these earlier forms. They kept the flame of performance alive through centuries. More than just theatrical history, these plays tell us about the medieval mind. They reveal a world where faith was central, where the stories of the Bible were not just ancient texts, but living realities shaping how people understood their lives and their place in the cosmos. They show a desire to make these stories accessible, to share them widely in a language and style people could connect with. They demonstrate remarkable creativity, community spirit, and a deep-seated human need to tell and retell foundational narratives, to explore the big questions of life, death, and salvation. Even today, in 2025, echoes of these medieval dramas can be found. Some towns still revive their ancient mystery play cycles as historical celebrations or as acts of continued faith. The themes of good versus evil, of temptation and redemption, these are timeless, and they continue to appear in our stories, on stage, in film, in books. So the next time you watch a play or a movie, spare a thought for those early monks, whispering their questions, for the guilds, proudly presenting their crafted scenes, for the crowds gathered in medieval squares. They were all part of a journey, the long, fascinating journey of theatre itself.